Well, guys, it is great to see you. It's great to be with you guys, and I want to welcome every single one of you that are here. If this is your first time to North Point, or if this is your first time in a long time back in church, or if you've been coming a while, or if you're watching or listening online, I just love the fact that you're here today, and I'm excited to be back with you. As over the last couple weeks, I've had some time off of teaching, and you guys have had the privilege to hear from Richard 2 weeks ago, if you were here. And then last week, if you were here, Wes taught. And those guys did such a remarkable job. And I'm so incredibly grateful for their willingness to serve you guys and to serve my beautiful wife and I, Jill and I, and our family. And because of their willingness to do that, it actually allowed Jill and I and our 5 boys to go on vacation. And we went to a world famous beach here in Texas called Port Aransas. You guys heard of that? You like that? Yeah, we really like that. We love Port Aransas. We love going there with the boys, and we create a lot of different memories. And so we were there for just over a week, and we had a lot of fun. But something that we did every single day that we'd go to the beach, here's what we would do. We spent a lot of our time doing this, or really our boys did this. They did a lot of fishing. And so they love fishing off, the surf and doing all that kind of stuff. And they caught a lot of different fish. And anytime you fish and you catch different kind of fish, you got to share your pictures. So I figured I'd share some pictures of the fish that our boys caught. And here's one of the fish that they caught. Here's our 2 youngest sons, that's Michael and Jonathan, and they caught a shark. So just FYI, anytime you go swimming in the ocean, you're swimming with sharks, baby, right? And that's a little black-tip shark that they caught, and we had a lot of fun doing that. And then here's a picture of my middle son right here. This is Timbo or Timothy, and I'm not sure what kind of fish that is. It's like, I call it like the catfish of the sea. I don't know, maybe if you're a fisher woman or man thing, But, and those were a lot of fun to catch because they fought like crazy, and it was really fun to watch our boys reel those in. And then, since I'm sharing pictures of our sons, I thought I'd share our 2 oldest sons. Here's our 2 oldest boys. Look at these guys. They're so cool. And you can see Sam kind of takes after his father. You can see his physique, right? Somewhere there. Not so much. Anyways, this is Sam and Luke, and they did a lot of fishing, and we had a lot of fun at the beach. And then what was really fun, this last Wednesday, July 4th, we were actually there as well. And so Jill, my beautiful wife, she loves to go to Old Navy and get all those like flag shirts and USA shirts and do all that stuff. And so we took a picture on the 4th at the beach, and here's our boys right here, all gathered together, and we had just a lot of fun, and I'm so incredibly grateful. And not only did, we fish and watch fireworks, but we played a lot of games. We played a lot of horseshoes and washers and all kind of, beach games. And the boys played the game, how many times can we not listen to mom and dad? You guys ever experienced that? I think they wanted that game. It was unbelievable. I was like, are you kidding me? But we had a lot of fun. We played a lot of games. And the reason I share that with you guys is because in this series, the thing that we've been talking about is the fact that we have a tendency, or there's a temptation in all of us, to play these things, to play relational games. And playing relational games, anytime we do that, we play a relational game, that's a dangerous game to play. Because in a relationship, in a healthy relationship, what you want to achieve, or the goal of that relationship, is to have a win-win. In a marriage, or in a friendship, or on a team, or in an organization, or on Camp 75 teams, you want everybody to win in that relationship. You want the best for them, and you want to grow closer and closer and closer in a win-win relationship. But see, when you play a game, in a game, there's always a winner and a loser. And that's not only true when you play games, but that's also true when you play relational games. And I think we all have experienced that. You've either played the game, these relational games, or you've experienced this, or you've seen people play this, and you've seen the winners and losers, and you see how playing relational games has torn relationships apart. For example, think of this. One of the relational games we play is the hurt game. Hey, you hurt me, so I'm going to hurt you. And I'm going to kind of one-up your hurt. And then you're going to get hurt, and then you're going to hurt me, and you're going to kind of one-up my hurt. And we go back and forth, and we raise the bar, and we continue to hurt and hurt and hurt, and there's a winner and there's a loser. And if you've ever played the hurt game, you feel how that pulls the relationship apart. Or maybe you've played this game, or maybe you've seen this game played, the blame game. Hey, it's your fault. It's your fault. No, it's your fault. I'm not going to look at my piece of the pie. I'm not going to look at how I contributed to what's happening in this relationship or what's going on. It's you, it's you, it's you, it's you, it's you. And if you've played the blame game, you know this. It's just this cyclical thing that ends in a place of nowhere. Because, ultimately, at the end of the day, it just tears the relationship apart. And when you play the blame game, oftentimes it leads to this game, the change game. Hey, if you would just change, then I would be happy. If you would just do these 3 things, then I would be happy. Well, if you would just do these 2 things, then I would be happy. And the change game is so kind of oppressive and it's shackling, isn't it? It's like imprisons you because that person on the other side of you, their happiness is contingent on you. And you know what that's called? It's called codependence. And if you've ever been on the other side of a very codependent person, my happiness is contingent on you and what you do and don't do. That is so shackling. And ultimately, that just pulls the relationship apart. And guys, I could go on, but I think the reality is, we've all experienced that. We've all been in the midst of. We all may have even played some of these games. And in this series, the thing that we're talking about is how do we recognize these relational games? And how do we stop playing these games and ultimately get to a place in a relationship to where we're in a win-win scenario? And so that's what we've been talking about. And today, as I wrap this series up, I want to talk about another relational game that we have a tendency to play or that we're tempted to play. And the thing I want us to talk about is the mind game. That I think all of us are tempted to play this very specific mind game. Now, again, there are all kinds of mind games that we play with one another. But today what I want to do is I want to focus on one very specific mind game we play in relationships. And to do that, let me illustrate it this way, or let me kind of explain it this way. Think about this. In every relationship, in every single relationship, there are these 2 kind of categories, if you will. There's a sender and there's a receiver. And for the sake of the illustration, I just made a guy a sender, the woman the receiver, but you can reverse this. If that, you can make the woman the sender and the guy the receiver. It really doesn't matter. The point is, in every relationship, you have somebody who's a sender, somebody who communicates, somebody who emails, somebody who sends a text, somebody who says something, does something, makes a decision. Maybe it's a boss who makes a decision. And then there's a receiver, somebody who has to receive what was sent. That's true in every relationship. And today, I'm not going to focus on the sender. We're not going to talk about why they sent that text, why they made that decision in that relationship, why they said those hurtful words to you. We're not going to talk about that. In fact, a lot of those things really need to be dealt with in professional counseling. It's a great place to kind of get those things out inside of us and why we do what we do and why we feel what we feel. Today, we're not going to focus on the sender. Today, we're going to focus on the receiver. Because all of us in relationships have been a receiver. And there is something we can specifically do in relationships as a receiver. There's a decision we can make that is a game changer. I'm telling you, it's a game changer in every one of your relationships. In a marriage relationship, it's a decision that will change that marriage relationship for the better. In a parenting relationship with your sons or daughters or students with your moms and dads, there's a decision you can make that is a game changer. In friendships, in work cultures, in organizational cultures, in families, there is something I want us to talk about today. That if we're willing to make this decision, which is a hard decision, it's a hard choice. But if we can make this choice, I'm telling you guys, it's a game changer. It brings our relationships closer and closer and closer. In fact, today, if I had to summarize what I want us to focus on, I would say it this way. I want us to talk about the receiver's interpretation of the sender's communication. In other words, think of it this way, that in every relationship, you have an action and a feeling, similar to what I said with the sender and receiver, right? But in every relationship, you have an action, somebody emails, somebody says something, somebody does something, somebody makes a decision. You have an action, and then there's a feeling associated with that action. And think of this, for example, perhaps, use your imagination, that, in your imagination, perhaps you're not a fan of your mother-in-law. Just pretend that, right? Imagine, you're not a fan of your mother-in-law, and your wife sends you this text, knowing you're not a fan of your mother-in-law. And your wife sends a text that says something like this. There's the action. Invited my mom over for dinner tonight. Hope that's okay. All of a sudden with that action, what happens? There is a feeling, and if you're not a fan of your mother-in-law, there is a negative feeling that comes out of you, right? And those feelings begin to impact your thoughts and impact our interpretations. Or maybe let's flip this around. Imagine this. Imagine it's Saturday morning. You and your husband have already agreed to do several things on Saturday morning, and then you get this text from your husband. And he sends this to you. He says, hey, okay with you if I play golf Saturday? And you're going, what? Like today? We had things planned, right? And immediately when you get that kind of text, there is this feeling, and oftentimes when it's something that you didn't expect, or something that you're not a fan of, or something that kind of came out of the blue, it creates this negative feeling. And this is true not only with text, but it's true with our communication. It's true with decisions. It's true pretty much in every relationship, that there is an action. And with every action, there is a feeling. Now, the danger in this is oftentimes we take those feelings and we attribute those feelings to the action. In other words, we take those negative feelings, and those negative feelings begin to impact our thoughts, and we begin to take those thoughts in our mind, and we play the mind game, and we begin to say, hey, you know what? Here's what they meant. Here's what they did. Here's why they said that. Here's why they posted that on social media. And we begin to interpret the action based upon our feelings. That's a dangerous thing to do. And the reason why that's a relationally dangerous thing to do is because this. And maybe this is why you came to North Point this morning, to take this away. This is important to understand in life. Feelings aren't facts. Those feelings, because of the action, that feeling of loneliness, that feeling of, hurt, that feeling of it's not fair, that feeling of how could you have done that, those are all real. I'm not denying that. Feelings are real. But we've got to understand that feelings aren't facts. In fact, my counselor says all the time to me, when I talk about my marriage and I'm, saying, hey, this is what I feel, or I talk about parenting and I'm like, oh, this is what I feel about my boys, or I talk about myself and I go, here's what I feel about me. My counselor reflects back over and over, Buck, feelings aren't facts. Feelings aren't facts. Feelings aren't facts. They're real. What you feel is real, but your job is to discover what's true. What's true about what happened? What's true about the action? That's your job. But the problem is, what they did, what they said, what they communicated, what they posted on social media, the action was real. And our feelings feel so real. And oftentimes we allow our feelings to influence our thoughts, to influence our minds, which interprets the actions, and we begin to assume. And when you assume in a relationship, it's true. It makes that thing out of you, and it makes that thing out of them, right? And it pulls the relationships further and further apart. So what do we do about all that? Because what they said and what they did, it is real. And what you feel, it is a real feeling. So how do we handle that? How do we make sure it's a win-win and get closer and closer in our relationships? Well, the good news is this, is that 2,000 years ago, a man by the name of Paul, he actually addressed this very specific tension. And he addressed it in a letter written to a group of people called Corinthians. And if you're not familiar with Paul and the letter of Corinthians, I'll give you a little bit of context because it's such a fascinating story. But Paul was the most prolific first century missionary. If you think of Paul, this guy did more for the spread of Christianity, for people understanding who Christ is, than really any other missionary in the first century. He was amazing. And Paul went around the Mediterranean rim, and he went from town to town, place to place, and his basic message was, hey, you can have peace with God. You can really have peace with God. And it's simple. There's this man named Jesus Christ, and he's the Son of the living God. And he died on the cross to pay for your sin, which is the obstacle to your peace with God. And when you put your faith in Jesus Christ, that he is the unique Son of God, that he died on the cross for my sins, you have peace with God because he dealt with the obstacle of your peace, which is your sin. And it's that simple. And one of the towns he went to was a town called Corinth. And I've shared this before, but Corinth, it's just a wild town. It was a town very similar to Vegas. And, the bold, the beautiful, the talented, the rich, the famous, they all went there, had a place there. And, what happened in Corinth stayed in Corinth. It's just a wild place. And Paul went to Corinth and he shared this incredible news, like you can have peace with God. And it's simple, it's through faith in Jesus Christ. And all these Corinthians put their trust in Christ. And then Paul helped, shape the very first church, this gathering of people, this movement of people around this one truth that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. He helped shape that. And then Paul went, from town to town and left Corinth and all this kind of stuff. And the church begins to grow. And as the church is growing, they're having all these relational tensions. They're playing these relational games. And so eventually they begin to write a letter to Paul and say, Paul, we're having all these, relational gaps and this relational tension. Would you help us with this? And Paul writes a letter back addressing the tension we're talking about today. And he actually addresses it in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Now, if you grew up in church or maybe you remember your vows at your wedding, maybe you've heard 1 Corinthians 13 referred to as the love chapter, right? It's like, oh, that's the love chapter you're talking about. And I get that, and that's understandable, but a more appropriate title is actually the leadership chapter. This is all about leadership. Because you read chapter 10, 11, and 12, and you see all the issues in the church and all these relational issues and this disunity and all this stuff. And Paul is addressing this, and he's saying, hey, leaders, here's what love requires of you. Here's what this looks like. Here's how you take this disunity and move back to a healthier relational place as leaders. In other words, you could actually title it the unity chapter because it's all about how to achieve relational unity. And the secret sauce, the thing that Paul says will bring us back to be unified relationally is one word. He says, love. Love. If you and I simply do what love requires of us in our relationships, it's a game changer. It really is. If you're willing to make the choice and do what love requires of you in your friendships, on your Camp 75 teams, in your dating relationships, in your marriage relationships, parenting relationships, Paul's saying, guys, this is the game changer. Now, you hear that and you go like, what? Just love? What does that even mean, Paul? And Paul begins to elaborate, and he gives us an idea of what this love looks like. And he personifies love, which is really important to understand. He says, here's what it looks like. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It's not proud. There's not pride in love. It does not dishonor others. It's not self-seeking. It's not selfish. It's not easily angered. It keeps no records of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with truth. And then he says this is so fascinating. He says, it, meaning love, always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. And then I love that. Love never fails. Amazing. And just imagine in your personal life, right now in this moment, a time of reflection. Imagine if that kind of love is what characterized your relationships. Imagine if that kind of love characterized your friendships, or was found in your marriage, or was found in your parenting relationship with your son or daughter, or is found in your relationship with your mom or dad, or is found in your organization, that's how the people in your organization, that's how they acted with one another, that they weren't easily angered, that they didn't keep a record of wrong, that they were kind and they were patient with one another. See, I think all of us would agree and say, wow, that'd be a game changer. That would actually make things better. And what's amazing about this, kind of a side note, is that as Paul is writing this, you have to know, because he personified love, you have to know he's thinking about Jesus. And he's thinking about, how did Jesus love me? How did Jesus love us? How did Jesus love you? And he writes that down, and he's like, oh man, he was so kind to the tax collector and the prostitute and the sinner and the people who gathered around him. He was kind. He kept no record of wrongs. Just amazing. And he captured the way Jesus Christ, the way God loves you. And then he had to remember what Jesus said. Because Jesus, in one moment, he captured all the laws, all the commandments. And Jesus, in one moment, he said all those thou shalts and do not, and you should do this, all those kind of laws and commandments, all the 600 plus commandments. In one moment, Jesus took all of that, centralized it to one commandment. As a follower of Jesus Christ, he says, the one command I give you is love, as I have loved you. And if we're willing to do the one thing Jesus asked us to do, it honestly is a game changer. And you know, Paul had to know that as he was writing. But imagine, if this is what your relationships were characterized by, the health and the camaraderie and the unity that you would experience. Now, in verse 7, Paul actually says something that I want us to really focus on because it's so specific to our discussion. He says these words, 2 words. He says, always trust. That's what love does. That love always trusts. Now, literally, you could say that love believes all things. That's what it would literally mean in the Greek. That, hey, in this relationship, whatever you say, whatever's done, I believe all things. In other words, practically speaking, if you were to take, here's what love requires of us, to always trust, and you were to go, what does this look like in a relationship? Here's what it would look like. For example, it would look like this, that love gives the benefit of the doubt. In other words, when there's an action, somebody texts you, somebody says something, somebody does something, a decision is made by your teacher, your boss, your coach, whatever it is, and you have to receive that you would just give the benefit of the doubt. When those negative emotions begin to rise and those negative feelings like, I can't believe what were they thinking? That immediately we capture those feelings and we say, hey, feelings aren't facts, but what love requires of me in this relationship, in all relationships, is to give the benefit of the doubt. I bet there's a good reason. I bet there's a good reason why they sent that. I bet there's a good reason why they made that decision. That's what it looks like. Love always trusts. Or another example, love always trusts in a relationship would mean love infers the best motives. When somebody makes a decision and it impacts you in that relationship and it impacts you perhaps in a negative way, or that's the perception, immediately you would capture your feelings and say, feelings aren't facts. What I'm called to do as a follower of Christ is to do what love requires of me. And that's to go, maybe there's just pieces of context I don't have. I bet there was a good reason. I bet their heart was in a good place. I bet when they said that and that felt very hurtful, I bet there was a good motive behind that I just don't see. Or love. Love does not suspect another unjustly. That love always trusts means that love is not suspicious in relationships. Love doesn't go around kind of looking for, you did that. I bet you're just all about you, and it's always been about you, or you're all about him, or he's all about him, or she's all about her, and it's all about this. That you're not suspicious. That love always trusts. Now, I would imagine, as I was thinking about this and reading this week, I would imagine if you're sitting there, perhaps there is a little bit of pushback here, right? Because I put myself in your place and I said, well, if I was listening to what I was saying, what would I be thinking? And I began to think, well, my internal lawyer would come on and go like, really? That's what that looks like? Like, Buck, do you live in the real world? Have you experienced real relationships? Because that is so delusional. That is so idealistic. Like, that's not reality. Like, come on. And listen, I get it. I understand that pushback, and I understand there's so much complexity in relationships, and there's a lot of pain in relationships. And I want you to know, I understand that. But I think the thing we really have to consider is the fact that there is objective, quantifiable research that actually says what Paul says is true. What he says is true. In fact, there's an author by the name of Marcus Buckingham. He wrote a great book. I would highly recommend it. It's called The One Thing You Need to Know. And it's a leadership book, and it's about, leaders as a leader of an organization, as a leader of pretty much anything. What's the one thing you need to know to bring unity, to bring health to whatever you're leading? It's a great, great book. In the first part of the book, he talks about relationships and all this research on relationships. And then he gets very specific, and he talks about marriage relationships. And he says the majority of research in terms of marriage relationships is very negative. It's to say, here's the 2 things that didn't work in a marriage, or here's the 3 things, or 5 things, and this is why the marriage failed because of these negative reasons. So as a person who's married, you should avoid these very negative things. That's the majority of the research is in that context. But then he says there's other research, and it's much more positive. And the other research looks at some of the healthiest, happy couples, not honeymoon couples. The average couple that the research was on was married 11 to 12 years. And he said, in couples that are genuinely happy, authentically connected, in those couples, let's research what they do on a positive basis that really makes it a win-win kind of relationship. And this research was all around the United States of America with all these different professors, different universities, as well as in Canada. It's fairly extensive. And at the end of the day, after they did all this research and said, what's the secret ingredient? What's the secret sauce to make happy couples genuinely, authentically happy? Here's the conclusion. They said the individuals in a happy relationship find the most generous explanation for each other's behavior and believe it. That couples in a win-win relationship, and I would extend this not only to marriages, but friendships and work relationships and family relationships. When we choose to find the most generous explanation and believe it, it's a game changer. For example, let's go back to the slide that we were looking at. You know, in every relationship, there's an action, and there's a feeling associated with that action. And imagine this. For example, here's kind of what Marcus is getting at, or here's what the research is saying. Imagine if you got a text from your wife that asks you, have you mowed the lawn today? Or are you going to mow the lawn today, right? And if you get that text from your wife, typically there's a little bit of a negative feeling. Like oftentimes you think, like, seriously, you're texting me that? Like, don't you know I told you I was going to mow the lawn? I mean, aren't you grateful for what I do? And we can go on and on and on with those negative feelings. But what the research is saying is to say, no, let's capture those thoughts and tell ourselves that feelings are not facts. Our job is to find the truth. And what love requires of me is to find the most generous explanation. So the text, are you going to mow the lawn today? Is to go, you know what? A generous explanation is maybe she's genuinely asking the question. Maybe she's just curious. And I bet that's what's taking place. I mean, just to land there in your interpretation of the action is a very positive place. Or maybe you would take it even a step further and go, you know what? I bet she has a surprise party for me tonight. And she just wants to know where I'm at. She's like, are you checking? You know, this is the way she's kind of covertly checking, right? You know, maybe that's it. Or maybe a really good explanation, and guys, you get this in the room, but maybe it's code word for come on home, baby. Right? I mean, that's a generous explanation. But come on, here's the deal. I mean, you may hear that and you may go, well, that's so silly, or, you know, that still seems too idealistic. But isn't it true, those of you in the room, those of you watching or listening online, isn't it true that if you're a genuinely happy couple, that you know what Paul said is spot on? Because you know for months and months and years in your relationship, you have chosen over and over and over and over again to find the most generous explanation for their behavior. And it's led you closer and closer and closer together. And isn't it also true that if you're here today, or you're watching or listening online, and there's distance in your relationship, there's a gap in your relationship, there's a lot of negativity in your relationship, isn't it true that you would also say, I think Paul is spot on? Because perhaps for weeks and weeks, months and months, or maybe even for years and years, your natural bend, your lean, is to pay attention to your feelings, these negative feelings, and call them facts. And they've influenced your thoughts and the interpretations of the actions. And it's negative, negative, negative. And it's pushed you further and further apart. So, what do we do with all that? So I thought about that this week. I thought, here's some takeaways that I would love all of us to walk out of this room. In light of what Paul has said, here's what love requires of you. Some takeaways I would love all of us to walk out of the room is what I want to end our time with. And I got to kind of condition these takeaways. I've just got to say this. Listen, if you're here today and you're a Christian, or you're watching online and you're a Christian, what I'm about to give you as takeaways in terms of just summarizing what love requires of us according to Paul. As a Christian, this is not optional. This is what you're called to do. Jesus' command, he boiled everything down in one command: love Christ's followers as I have loved you. So if you're a Christian, This is not optional. This is what we're called to do in our relationships. If you're not a Christian, you can pick and choose anything I'm about to say. You can go, I like that, but I don't like that. I mean, it's all optional for you. But let me just say this. There's quantifiable, objective research that says if you're willing to do what Paul is talking about, it'll work for you. It really will. It will help your relationships get better and better and better. So, here's a couple takeaways. The first thing I would say is in terms of what love requires of you in our relationships, love requires you to admit your interpretation lacks information. In other words, anytime there's an action and it creates that feeling inside of you and you're like, oh, and it begins perhaps to go negative, it's to capture that feeling. It's to tell yourself feelings aren't facts. My job is to find out what's true. And what love requires of me is to say, perhaps I don't have all the information. Perhaps I don't have all the context. Perhaps my assumptions are wrong. And guys, if we just did that, if we just started the whole process of interpretation of action with saying, maybe I don't have all the information, perhaps I'm wrong, perhaps my assumptions are wrong, maybe there's something I don't see, I'm telling you, that would simply be a game changer in our relationships. The second takeaway I would say is this. What love requires of us, according to Paul, is to choose to believe the best, to choose the most generous explanation and believe it. Now, this is a very difficult choice. And as I was thinking this week, what influences our ability or inability to make this choice? What's the biggest thing that influences that? This week I thought about it and I said, it's got to be our heart. It's got to be the heart. The condition of your heart has more to do with your ability or inability to choose to believe the best than I think anything else. For example, Jesus said this. He said, for whatever's in your heart determines what you say. That Jesus said, hey, whatever's in you is going to come out of you regardless who's with you. So if you don't feel good about you, like if you look at yourself in the mirror and you're like, there's a lot of negative thoughts about you and the way you look and the way you feel, and that's the condition of your heart, then it makes it virtually impossible for you to find the most generous explanation for somebody on the other side of you. Makes it extraordinarily difficult. Or if the condition of your heart, there's a lot of hurt and there's a lot of anger. Anger is just unprocessed hurt, perhaps from an ex-wife or an ex-husband, maybe from a mom or a dad or that person who did something they should have never done. And I'm not trying to justify anything that has happened to you. But when you don't process that hurt, it turns into anger. And if that's the condition of your heart, hurt and anger, it's extraordinarily difficult for you to make the choice to say, you know what? I'm going to choose the most generous explanation for her or for him. If the condition of your heart, if there's unforgiveness in there, if there's that idea to go, you know what, here's what they've done, and I'm going to punish them for what they've done. I'm going to be kind of passive aggressive. I'm going to withdraw myself. I'm going to say some hurtful things. I'm going to play some other relational games. If that's the case and that's a condition and you're not intentionally working through the steps and stages of forgiveness for what they've done, I'm just telling you, again, the condition of your heart makes it almost impossible for you to choose the most generous explanation. Or if you've got a secret, if you have told yourself this myth, that as long as no one knows what I did behind closed doors or what I do behind closed doors, as long as no one knows what I did with him or with her, then everything will be okay. Guys, that's a myth. Because what's in you will come out of you regardless who's with you. And it influences your ability to choose to look at him, look at her when there's an action that's creating a negative feeling, and choose to believe the best. Now, I think you hear that and you go, well, I get that. I think it's important for us to pay attention to the condition of our heart. But I think maybe there's a different pushback. Maybe you hear that and you go, okay, I get all that. But here's the thing, Buck. I've got relationships to where there is justification for my negative, interpretation of their action. In fact, because for months and months or weeks and weeks or years and years, whatever it is, they have just done this thing over and over and over. And if I had to stand in a court of law and prove that my negative interpretation of their action is true, it would be easy, because look at their past, look at what they've done, look at their choices. If that's where you're at and you find it almost impossible to choose the most generous explanation in that relationship, then here's what I would say love requires of you and love requires of me, is that love requires of us to ask directly when you just can't believe the best. Love requires of us to go to the person directly and say, hey, I just want to let you know I'm having a hard time believing the best. Now, do you know what we do when we're having a hard time believing the best with an individual in a relationship? What we naturally do, what the kind of the gravitational pull is to go tell our friend, isn't it? It's like, we're not going to go directly to the person, but I'm going to tell my friend. And I'm going to tell them all about him and, what he did and how he acted and his decisions and how he's wrong, or all about her and how her decisions and how she's wrong. And then not only do we tell a friend, but then we really play the gossip game, the gossip relational game. And we tell a bunch of people, and we text them saying, hey, let me know, let me tell you what's going on. I'll inform you of my feelings and what's happened and all about him and all about her. And you build all this negativity against that one individual, where that one individual could never do anything to get back in your good graces. Let me just say, gossip is one of the most unloving things you can do. What love requires of us to do when we are having a difficult time believing the best is to ask directly, to go directly to that person, as hard as that may be. And I'm not pretending to think that's easy. That's difficult. Invite God into that decision. Ask him to empower you to have the ability to go directly to them and sit down with that individual and say, hey, this is really hard for me to say. I'm just having a really difficult time finding the most generous explanation with what's going on. And I'm guessing there are things I just don't know. I'm guessing things I just don't see. I would say there's more context. So do you think we could have a discussion about that? And here's what will happen 9 out of 10 times. 9 out of 10 times, there is more context. 9 out of 10 times, there's more information that you just didn't have. And 9 out of 10 times, you're going to walk out of that room, walk out of the coffee shop, walk out of whatever context that is. And you're going to be relationally closer to that individual. Do you know why? Because you did what love requires of you. You see, the bottom line is this, is that the interpretation we choose will determine the amount of distance between us. And you need to know the choice is yours. And you are free to make that choice. God is not going to determine and make you make that choice. He has given you freedom to choose the negative or the positive. And how you choose and your choice will have more to do with the condition of your relationships and the closeness of that relationship than perhaps you know. Now, let me just say one quick thing. I know there are outliers in our relationships. I'm not talking about abusive relationships. I'm not talking about some of these outliers in relationships. That is a completely different discussion. But when it comes to your marriage, when it comes to your friendships, when it comes to your kids, when it comes to your mom and dad, when it comes to your Camp 75 teams, when it comes to your work culture, what love requires us to do is this. That love requires us to find the most generous explanation for each other's behavior and believe it. And when you and I do what love requires of us, it's a big step to allow relationships to move to a win-win relationships and get closer and closer and closer. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you so much for your love for us. Thank you that you love us in this way, that you're so patient with us, that you're not easily angered. Thank you for loving us unconditionally. And God, I know this discussion is difficult. We have a lot of different relationships and so many complexities. So God, I just ask for the courage. I know I personally need that. I ask for the courage for all of us to do what love requires of us so we can ultimately experience a closer and closer relationship with you and with those around us. In Jesus' name, amen. Guys, thanks so much for being here. I'll see you next week.